Anne here, and this is More Than a Love Interest, the show where we talk about the arcs of female characters in film. This is the fourth in my series on the Black Widow in the MCU, other videos in the thing. Today, we're gonna have to talk about a low point. Now, I try to be positive on this channel, but there aren't a lot of good things I have to say about the Age of Ultron or Natasha's role in it. In fact, I will be talking about some pretty heavy topics, so trigger warnings apply and you may want to consider skipping this one. I will be discussing Nat's role in the movie, how women are treated generally and her specifically by the narrative, and probing into how apt all of those Frankenstein references really are. Let's get started. Okay, here we go. What does the Black Widow do in this movie? How does she impact the plot? I think the best way to discuss this is to go through her scenes and look at similar ones in other movies in the MCU to point out why I, at least, found her role here to be pretty disappointing. First, in the opening battle, she beats up some guys, and then runs to fuss over Clint after he gets shot. Compared to Captain America the Winter Soldier, where she secures the engine room by herself, or Iron Man 2, where she breaks into Hammer's compound on her own, or the first Avengers, where she takes out the Russian mob who have taken her captive. The other Avengers are also beating up goons, but they get to do a lot more that moves the plot forward.
Please be a secret door, please be a secret door, please be a secret door. Yay!
After he's injured, Thor takes Clint back to the Quinjet.
Clint's hit pretty bad, guys. We're gonna need evac.
I can get Barton to the jet.
So what was the point of taking her out of the fight? Before I go on, yes, I am well aware that Scarlett Johansson was pregnant during this movie. That will come up later, but stunt doubles are pretty common in these scenes anyway. It was no reason to have her sit out part of the battle.
Thank you.
In the next scene, she does the lullaby to bring Banner back.
The sun's getting real low.
Sun's getting real low.
I'm going to talk about this a lot more in the next section, so let's just say, okay, point for this movie, Nat got to do a thing that mattered, probably. I would say it pales in comparison to what everyone else is doing, but as we see in a later scene in South Africa, it was pretty important that she do this. Cool. She chats with Bruce in the Quinjet and tries to get him to be okay with what he just did, which reflects how she talks to Steve about the Winter Soldier in the last movie, or Selvig and Clint after being brainwashed by Loki, so it's nice to continue that character trait. She chats with Helen Cho and Clint back in Avengers Tower, but does not contribute to the plot-related discussions that are going on with everyone else. At the party, she flirts with Bruce, refuses to try her hand at Thor's hammer because she knows she could lift it, and then saves Bruce when Ultron starts wrecking things. So that's another point of her doing something helpful. Yay! We get a few exposition-heavy scenes in which she gets to say something occasionally.
Clear and present as Ultron.
Compared to the others, she does not say much and little of it matters.
Yeah. Everything we had on Strucker's been erased.
In The Winter Soldier, Steve gave the orders, but he listened to what Nat suggested in several scenes. In Avengers, she has the plot-relevant idea of closing the portal. In Iron Man 2, she gives Tony and Rhodey a lot of helpful information during the climax. So her usual role as a spy is very much diminished in this movie. She doesn't really provide any intel, despite her being the most likely one to know anything about Wakanda, Vibranium, or Claw as a high-level SHIELD agent, and her only act of espionage is to use Morse code later. Nat beats up some dudes in South Africa, but then Wanda comes along and makes her remember some stuff that, whew, boy, will I be talking about a lot more in a minute. But what does this do for Nat's agency? She's not there to bring the Hulk in, and he goes on a rampage that causes some major problems. But framing that as her fault is, not great. Speaking of, why is she susceptible to Wanda's mind games? Clint gets a moment of overcoming his previous brainwashing by being prepared.
I've done the whole mind control thing.
Not a fan.
But why is this not a power moment for Nat? Wanda is just doing the same thing as Loki.
Dracov's daughter. Sao Paulo. The hospital fire.
Playing up her sordid past, and she easily countered that. This version might be a vision instead of just a reference, sure, but we already know that she's had people
Take your brain and play.
so I can't imagine why this would affect her so much. Why doesn't she get a scene like Clint's, where she is able to overcome the vision easily? If they needed the Hulk to go on a rampage, they could easily handwave that the lullaby wouldn't work against whatever Wanda did to him. So it definitely seems forced to put her out of commission like this. Secondly, why is she so affected by her visions afterward? To compare to the dudes, Tony sees a vision of a future he fears. It's something he is already worried about, and wanting to make Ultron is a dream of his. Wanda's games might give him a push and kick off the movie, but they don't affect his emotional state or ability to work. Thor presumably feels guilty about leaving his people behind for the last year or however long that he's been on Earth, and his vision makes that a more pressing worry. Steve gets a vision of his unresolved trauma with no apparent effect on what he does next. Nat sees her backstory, which, she's pretty familiar with and fairly frank about.
I thought I knew whose lies I was telling, but
Is she a spy too? They start that young.
I did. It's a good way not to die, though.
We, the audience, might be shocked by it, but why would she be? Why would being reminded of it change her behavior at all? Unlike Steve, who is clearly repressing his issues, she doesn't seem to be. And her whole motivation in being an Avenger is because she wants to make up for her past.
I got red in my ledger. I'd like to wipe it out.
So being reminded of her assassin training just seems like it would motivate her more, not make her want to run away.
If running's the plan, as far as you want.
So I'm going to count that as a pretty significant blow to her agency. She can't handle Wanda's mind games as well as anyone else, and then doesn't do the job that was her one contribution to the team so far in this movie. It's
sloppy.
Anyway, Fury shows up and barely talks to her despite their relationship being one of her strongest. She has nothing to say in the discussion of what to do.
We have an ally?
Ultron's got an enemy. That's not the same thing.
Except to be wrong about stuff again.
When you two programmed him to protect the human race, you amazingly failed.
They don't need to be protected.
She joins Steve and Clint on a mission to get the cradle, which she does manage to do, but then gets captured in a baffling scene. If Ultron desperately needs the cradle, why not grab it instead of her? Or with her? Clint doesn't leave right away, so Ultron just snatches Nat and flies off, I guess. Seems like he's choosing to kidnap her instead.
I wasn't sure you'd wake up. I hoped you would. I wanted to show you.
And then she's the damsel in distress. The woman who, when told that the Falcon Wings were
behind 3 guarded gates and a 12-inch steel wall,
just shrugged. Who we met tied to a chair and being interrogated, but easily escaped when asked. She just hides in this cell until Bruce rescues her. So that's another pretty major mark against her agency in this movie. I mean, she alerts them to her location using Morse code. Cool. Spy stuff. But she's in the base where they started the movie. It would not be difficult to have some other excuse for them to find where Ultron is, from a writing perspective. During the final battle, she wakes up the Hulk and shoots some robots. And then her lullaby fails because she's getting shot at. And then it's basically over. She fails to bring the Hulk back.
Now I need you to turn this bird around, okay?
She gets to ask baffling questions of Fury.
You sent me to recruit him. Did you know then what was gonna happen?
Why would she ask Fury if he knew? If he knew what, exactly? That she would like Bruce? Because Bruce just left without looking back. There isn't really anything for Fury to know here. So this just feels like Laura's comment here.
What about Nat and Dr. Banner? How long has that been going on?
Or Steve's here.
But with you, she seems very relaxed.
That are insisting Bruce Nat is a thing. And I'm just confused because, it is a thing? They flirt with each other. They talk about running away together. They kiss. These just make it seem like the writing couldn't be trusted to sell the relationship and had to add these weird things. And knowing what we know about the writer, that kind of gives me hives. You can ship what you want. I think Bruce Nat could make sense. But the way it is forced into this movie, instead of fleshing out Nat to make her attraction to him more obvious / make sense, or have him show any signs of reciprocating, they have these lines that gaslight you into thinking that there was more to it than there was. Laura says this after she has not seen them interact at all. Like, what the
Language!
Anyway, back to Nat's agency. She gets to do a couple things, sure, but very little compared to anyone else, even compared to Helen Cho or Maria Hill, who are relatively minor characters. She is one of the original 6 Avengers, and her role on a mission is worrying over injured men or calming down the Hulk afterward. Like, yeah, melee combat isn't exactly her skill set, but
I have a very specific skill set.
and she could be using them somehow. She's so upset by a reminder of her past that she decides to quit her job. You know, the one she was doing to make up for her past actions.
That I was anything more than the assassin they made me.
The only impact she has on the plot is negative. She doesn't lullaby Hulk and keep him from wrecking a town. She doesn't bring him in at the end, so he goes off on his own thing. She does tell Clint where Ultron is, but then just sits around and waits to be rescued. She doesn't, use her skills as a spy to find out his weaknesses or something. So this is honestly one of the worst representations of a female character that I've ever seen, in terms of getting to be in control at any point in the story.
Do you know how it felt?
Going from Captain America the Winter Soldier to this was a pretty big shock for us ladies.
It felt like that.
But let's dive into the, female character bit a little more.
Where are the ladies, gentlemen?
I'm not gonna beat around the bush. Let's talk about the misogyny in this movie. From the most minor to the most egregious. First, the sex jokes.
You and Banner better not be playing hide the zucchini.
Guy's multiplying faster than a Catholic rabbit.
Hi, Miss Spartan, you little minx.
You and Tony were still gazing into each other's eyes.
You, Clint, you've had a tough week. We won't hold it against you if you can't get it up.
Adam and Banner?
I'll explain when you're older.
Your own girlfriend won't be able to tell the difference.
Well, I will be reinstituting prima nocta.
Tony refers to prima nocta, a thing that I am very glad not to have to explain to children, and that really shouldn't be joked about. Seems like something the writer would find funny and gave it to Tony because he is charming.
I'm sorry.
But, yikes, that really makes Tony unlikable and not sound like he's in a happily committed relationship. While we're on the subject, Tony and Thor talking about their ladies.
Yeah, they must be busy because they'd hate missing you guys get together. Testosterone!
Kinda sweet, sure.
But Jane's better.
But having Maria lampshade how few women are in this movie really isn't the solution you think it is. Thor doesn't even know what country Jane is in.
Yes, I'm not even sure what country Jane's in.
Yikes. Anyway, this and some other sex jokes just seem really mean-spirited, which is not to say that adult references don't belong in a PG-13 movie, or any level of movie where the characters are adults. I just think the ones in this movie have a weird vibe that makes me uncomfortable. Like this one, which I sort of talked about in my Little Mermaid video. But basically, yeah, the punchline here definitely alienates at least half of the audience, which doesn't make for a very good joke. I also think this really encapsulates the differences between how Nat is treated in this movie and how she is treated in Winter Soldier. Because remember this scene? Nat jumps into Steve's lap and pulls his face into her chest to get him out of harm's way. You know, just like she's doing with Bruce. She sits on his lap for the rest of the scene, even feeling around between his legs for her gun. And this is not presented as sexual or comical. The point of the scene is that the Winter Soldier is relentless, and she's the only one who can outwit him, up to a point. But in Age of Ultron, this scene is 100% sexual. The point of it is for Bruce to fall into her rack. It's not about her saving his life, it's about a joke at her expense. So Winter Soldier emphasizes how she is just as important to the plot as the male heroes, while Age of Ultron goes out of its way to undermine her. Okay, anyway, let's talk about Maria and Helen. As I mentioned in the Winter Soldier video, there's some indication that at least during the early stages of that film, it looked like Sharon Carter was going to be the co-lead. And then there was a call for Nat to have her own movie, so she got the co-lead instead. So, while I think that Winter Soldier still did a great job of fleshing out its 3 main female characters, as the Avengers did with Nat, it doesn't change the fact that the MCU has a habit of viewing women as replaceable. And I think it is very important to say that we should absolutely not dislike Nat or other female characters because the writers treat them as interchangeable. That's on the writers, and I'm not going to dislike any of the ladies that we have. What I'm saying here is that I love Maria, and I'm happy to see her, but her presence as the spy who gives intel is one of the reasons why Nat has so little to do. Not because Maria is stepping on her toes, but because the writer is too uncreative to imagine what other use Nat could have if she isn't the one giving intel.
Sloppy.
That's my real concern here. Maria doesn't have much to do but be an exposition dump, which is fine, I guess. It's not a problem. What is a problem is that she was apparently a double agent for Fury this whole time.
I get it, Maria Hill called you, right? Was she ever not working for you?
And since Tony, our audience surrogate, is upset by it, it makes her look bad. For such a blink and you'll miss it moment, why couldn't this have been presented as Maria bringing in a helpful ally instead of insisting that she was duplicitous? Not a great look for someone we're supposed to like. Helen Cho is a unique character, but has very little to do. She gets brainwashed and then unbrainwashed by Wanda, neither of which impact the plot noticeably. I'll probably do a whole episode on Wanda later, but her pretty important decision to undo Helen's brainwashing because Wanda no longer trusts Ultron is immediately made useless.
That's not a problem.
So that kinda sucks. Another moment of invalidating a woman's agency. Anyway, Helen gets shot, gives exposition to Steve, and then he just leaves her there?
Go.
Doesn't really seem like the Cap I know. Unpacking the tropes with Wanda requires its own episode, so back to Nat. Now that you're hopefully convinced of the undercurrent of misogyny in this movie, let's consider again Nat's role on the team. In Iron Man 2, her role was helping Pepper, getting answers out of Hammer, infiltrating Hammer's facility, hacking into Venko's system, and saving Tony's and Rhodey's lives during the battle. In Avengers, her role was bringing in Bruce, successfully interrogating Loki, unbrainwashing Clint, and closing the portal. In The Winter Soldier, she gets Fury the intel from the ship, helps Steve be undercover, helps question Sitwell, saves all their lives from the Winter Soldier, a couple times, but especially this one, and destroys S.H.I.E.L.D. in a very real way by releasing the files.
Including Hydras.
And shields.
But in this movie, her role on the team is to give Bruce a lullaby when everything's over, and that's it. She isn't shown to be the reason why they know about this Hydra base, despite the fact that infiltrating it before they attack, or even during the attack, would definitely be a good use of her skills. And why is she the only one to do the lullaby? In their previous appearance, Steve is the first one to be nice to Bruce.
Only word I care about.
And Bruce and Tony really hit it off. Hulk and Thor also have a rapport, perhaps making him the safest one to approach the Hulk after the battle. But Nat and Bruce, well, she tricks him into coming in, something he is cranky about later.
Loki is manipulating you.
And you've been doing what exactly?
He chases her as the Hulk, which leaves her like this. They see each other again just once before the final battle, and I don't think they're on the best of terms here.
I've seen worse.
Sorry.
No, we could use a little worse.
Character development happens off-screen in these movies, and obviously the Avengers have been working together for a while. But of all the people to be in charge of calming the Hulk down after the battle, why Nat? You could argue it's because she is great at de-escalation, which would be a big part of her job, and relates to her assuring Steve, Selvig, and Clint that they shouldn't feel guilty, but that's not presented as an option by the film, and I think we as fans can call out poor writing instead of trying to justify it by making up explanations with little evidence. Okay, so Nat seems to have the least rapport with Bruce of the other Avengers, except for Clint, of course, and it doesn't really relate to the skills she has. What explanation can there be? That they like each other? Or she likes him? How did that conversation go? Well, Captain America, we have this idea of how to calm down the Hulk. Please let me do it because I have a crush on him. Or he does on her? It's not clear. But tactically, all of them should be able to do this. Maybe they all tried and she was best at it, but again, there's no evidence of that in the movie. So I think we can admit the real reason this is Nat's job. She's the girl one. And women are comforting, aren't we? We're so good at talking down violent men to stop being violent. That's a great role for us in society. Or maybe it's because obviously she's a weak feminine presence, and the Hulk couldn't possibly be threatened by her. Either way, not the gender dynamics I enjoy seeing in a fantastic story where a dude is brought to life by lightning. Speaking of which... Alright, I know this whole video has been a bit of a soapbox, but prepare for it to get even more so. I have read the book Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein.
Many times. I'm a big fan. I've analyzed it. I've given it a lot of thought. I've also seen the movie from the 30s on multiple occasions, and I can say, with confidence, that the writer of this has done none of those things. I was going to have a whole section of this video on how the smart references used in this film are kind of missing the point of the thing they're referencing, but I don't want to bore you, and this is a video about Nat. So I'm going to skip past all the other references to mad scientists and monsters and just talk about this one.
You still think you're the only monster on the team?
Now, trigger warnings abound for this discussion, so please proceed with caution. Let's go through this scene in order. Nat is remembering that time when she had invasive surgery done to her against her will. Bruce is remembering being the creature he turns into when he's mad. That is a result of experiments he chose to do on himself and generally protects him from harm. So, not a great parallel to start this with. And if you're like, but Anne, footage of Bruce Banner doing his experiments would use another actor and be confusing. I mean, they filmed new things for everyone else. They could definitely have done that with Mark Ruffalo here. They do some flirting that, frankly, feels like a pretty significant jump from their last scene together.
They used up all the hot water.
I should have joined you.
Where he was confused by her flirting with him.
Run with it, right?
But surprisingly, escalating romance isn't exactly uncommon in movies, so let's continue. Bruce says that because he hulked out, he has to go on the run, and she wants to go with him. Because, she explains, being an Avenger was a dream, and she's just an assassin.
That I was anything more than the assassin they made me.
Okay, I can buy that. It's very different from anything she's done before or was raised to do, so that could be what she's thinking about. More flirting, and I guess what really bugs me about this relationship is that it seems so one-sided.
You know I have to leave.
But you assume that I have to stay?
He's confused by her flirting.
What are you doing?
He literally calls her crazy for wanting to run away with him.
Out of your mind.
Like, rude. She assures him he's not a threat. He implies that a future with someone means having kids. And she brings up how the flashback she was remembering was actually when she lost her ability to have children. Okay, that's a lot. First, their flashbacks were put there at the beginning of this scene to presumably imply how similar they are. He remembers being a rage monster. She remembers having forced surgery. Those are not at all the same. Comparing them is already a problem.
There's no math there.
Now, let's talk about Nat's backstory in the comics. She is, in some of them, it gets retconned a lot, infertile. But it's because she has had some kind of super soldier serum, as well as other experiments that were designed to give her peak performance. Sterility was a side effect, much like Bruce's was, of doing these kinds of experiments. Keeping her original backstory would give them much more in common than this new one, especially since she could at least have been a willing participant in those trials, depending on the comic. Also important to her backstory is that she was adopted, so would probably be pretty accepting of adoption as an option if she wants to have a family. So, back to this movie, this backstory also sets her apart from the rest of the male Avengers, who all chose their paths to where they are now. Even Tony and Bruce choose to make Ultron, but Nat is presented as having no choice in any of this.
I have no place in the world.
Exactly.
The implication that she was a child and raised there is
Where I was raised.
also different from the comics and removes her agency in becoming the Black Widow. Again, not in the comics. So this new take on her history just seems specifically designed to remove her autonomy and pile on the tragedy. Also, just a side note here, but having this be a graduation ceremony for the Red Room seems like the writer gave it like 1 second of thought.
The ceremony is necessary.
If you were running a school to train young women into undercover assassins, the end product of a baby is not really going to be your first motivation to mess with their reproductive cycle. Like, not to make anyone uncomfortable here, but I can think of a monthly imposition that you might want to deal with long before making sure no babies come along. This is also the only time that being a Black Widow is explicitly tied to having sex, and I have a big problem with that. Nat uses whatever tools she has in her arsenal, yeah, but despite what spy movies may have taught us, taking the time and effort to bang someone is probably not the most efficient method of getting intel or doing an assassination. So I find this addition to be pretty gross writing on a number of levels.
That's really gross.
But unfortunately, there is even more to this scene. She tells him about her forced sterilization, something most people would be horrified by, and then says this is why she is also a monster.
You mother-grabbing bastard!
Well, that's certainly a fun take for this PG-13 romp to have. Ladies, we had our very pregnant actress say that not having kids makes you monstrous.
Traitor.
Now, again, you could do the writer's job for him and say, no, Anne, I'm sure he meant that she feels like a monster created by the Red Room to assassinate people. And yeah, that's probably what was meant. But that's not what was said. That's not how the scene plays out.
One less thing to worry about.
If that was the point, then she'd be talking about her kills right before calling herself a monster. Not talking about how she was sterilized.
Makes everything easier.
Now, let's finally go back to Frankenstein and why that's such a poorly used illusion here. The moral of Frankenstein is not to play God because you can't imagine the repercussions.
You have created a monster and it will destroy you.
First of all, they create vision, which goes really well for them, so already screwed up the metaphor by rewarding their efforts. But specifically, playing God here means creating life. A man creating life. Now, people in the 1800s knew that men were, involved in reproduction, but it's pretty standard for women to be seen as the creators of life. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein when she was in a cabin with a bunch of philosophical dudes about how bypassing the natural role of women in creating life has disastrous consequences. It's not just about that, but the gender dynamics of this book, especially in that Mary wrote the story through several layers of male narrators, are a pretty important aspect. And a big theme of sci-fi, inspired by this, the first science fiction novel, is about replacing women as the source of reproductive life. It's a common theme. Also important is the fact that the creature begs Victor to create a female monster so he will have a companion, an Eve to his Adam. And Victor is horrified and refuses because then they will have a whole race of these creatures around. And I bring all that up because the writer of this movie chose this book explicitly about how creating life is the province of women, where even a female creature would be fertile, to have the sole female Avenger say that since she can't have kids, she is a monster. And, well, Mary Shelley didn't keep her husband's calcified heart on her desk for her work to be used this way. There is a story in Greek mythology about Aphrodite. She is a beautiful goddess, the goddess of love, and the other gods are jealous. To bring her down off her perceived high horse, they trick her into marrying Hephaestus, the ugliest god and the only one with physical disfigurement. Because that, they think, is what she deserves for being so pretty and so independent. Scarlett Johansson was married and pregnant during this movie, so about as unavailable as a lady can get. And given recent and older information we've gotten about the writer, well, it seems like pairing her pretty, formerly independent character with the hideous beast that terrified her before was maybe not an unbiased choice. I don't mean to imply that ScarJo is a goddess, but I know petty revenge when I see it. So, is Nat more than a love interest? No, she's not. She has almost no agency in the film. She doesn't have any intel to offer. She doesn't use her spy skills really at all. And her sole purpose is being in a very one-sided relationship with the Hulk. Presumably, the directive was to make sure Hulk flies off into the sunset after creating Ultron to set up for his next appearance. And despite the fact that just the act of creating a murder bot
Only when I've created a murder bot.
would likely give him guilt enough to do just that, the writer decided to hurt the one female Avenger by having her throw herself at him, and that be what drove him away. And that makes this movie not only Nat's worst appearance, yes, worse than the one where she literally dies halfway through, because while she is often employed as a narrative tool to further a man's story, the other movies at least highlight her intelligence and her skills. But this one, it makes the Black Widow title something she never wanted.
I have no place in the world.
Something that keeps her from having a family,
Neither can I.
a legacy,
That's little Natasha, huh?
Nathaniel.
or even someone who loves her.
Nothing lasts forever.
And I find the decision to make that her story to be pretty monstrous.
That's not my story.
Alright, let's move on by talking about the comics. As a palate cleanser, I'd recommend reading Black Widow 2014. It's a great solo story for her and doesn't involve people taking away her agency at all. Thank you for listening to me analyze this low point in the MCU. Next time we'll talk about how integral she is to the team in Civil War.
We have one hand on the wheel, we can still see her.
Please like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all the things so you don't miss it. See you then!